Namaste and welcome to another insightful episode of Geo Interview, where we explore the complex landscape of geopolitics and its key players. Today, we are privileged to have with us a distinguished guest, Mr. Ariel Admoni, a PhD candidate at Berlin University. His research focuses primarily on Qatar, not only as a nation but in the broader geopolitical context. Today, we are excited to hear Mr. Ariel's thoughts on Qatar's changing role in both regional as well as global politics. So, sir, welcome to the Geo interview. It's a pleasure to have you here. How are you doing, sir?
I'm fine. I hope you're fine, and thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So, given your extensive research on Qatar's foreign policy, let's begin by discussing how Qatar navigates today's complex global environment. So, sir, how do you see Qatar's role, especially in recent geopolitical shifts?
So let's give a short historic review. We talk about an emirate that is very young, especially when we examine the broader Arabian Gulf. We talk about an emirate that the ruling family Athani is here from, let's say, the middle of the 19th century, 1851. The formal, let's say, the founder emir is rose to power at, let's say, almost 30 years later, 1878. And later on, in 1916, there were the discovery of oil and the treaty with Britain. And later on, in 1971, the Emirate received independence from Britain. And the major geopolitical change was in the 1990 when Qatar discovered the gas fields. So when we remember let's say the context of this region, we need to remember the energy factor. But Qatar was smart to know that energy is just one key factor. Qatar understand she need to balance the, let's say, the major allies and neighbors, especially Iran and Saudi Arabia, and not to anger anybody on one side. But what was special about Qatar, especially since the 1990, that when the state tried to distinguish itself, uh, she prefer, let's say, be annoying on the expense of being avoidance. For this reason, they chose to communicate even with hardliners and with terrorist groups in order to distinguish itself and to transform itself to a player that everyone needs to contact: the US and the Taliban, Russia and Ukraine. And you see that my examples are talking about nowadays, but the events that we see nowadays are actually a product of Qatari policy since the 1990 and even before.
Sir, yes, sir. You have made an excellent observation regarding Qatar's shifting diplomacy, and sir, but I have noticed that some analysts believe that these changes have brought both benefits as well as challenges. So, sir, do you think that this have affected how other Gulf country or other states view Qatar, especially in terms of regional cooperation or you can say competition?
Let's say that. The Qatari approach is mainly focused on itself. For this reason, this region that worked many initiatives together, maybe the most famous one is the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the fact there is many connection between the states. And when Qatar tried or even succeeded in pursuing a policy, a problematic policy, according to its neighbors, that sometimes disrupts the delicate balance in the region, and actually not just in the region. We need to remember that some of the steps that Qatar took. Let's take, for an example, Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera was promoted the Qatari point of view and promoted Qatar itself It's sufficient to hear the name Al Jazeera in Arabic, Shib Al Jazeera, the peninsula. And when you look at the map, the peninsula, the big one, is the Arabian Peninsula. But Al Jazeera puts Qatar on the map, and just like the channel, the state itself tried to distinguish itself on the expense of others. And its neighbors, but not just its neighbors. For an example, I gave the example of Al Jazeera. Previous Egyptian president Hosni Mubarak was in a tour in Doha, and he said about Al Jazeera, it's unfathomable that a building in a size of a medium hotel causing me so much trouble in my big country. And the Qatari stance that was sometimes very annoying to its neighbors come on its expense. So for this reason, we saw that not long ago, from 2017 to 2021, there was an embargo or a blockade. It depends who you ask. If you ask the UAE, it was such severe of ties, but if you ask Qatar, it was a blockade. And this was an example to the fact that the region told Qatar to stop. Actually, they told Qatar in a very detailed document with 13 demands. One of them was a call for Qatar to stop with the duplicity in Al Jazeera, in Iran, in subversive funding subversive organization, and the region tried to tell Qatar to stop. So let's say that the fact that Qatar, in a way, in a manner to balance the delicate situation, chose not to respect it, but to disrupt it in a way that will promote Qatar was very problematic to its neighbors. But at the same time, we have to admit, gave Qatar a unique position that until this day, after even this conflict resolved, we still see some animosity, mainly on internet campaigns and some high-level briefings. But still, the animosity is still there because as a raison d'etre, the Qataris for the last 30 years disrupt this balance in order to put themselves on the map.
Yes, sir. So you just mentioned about Al Jazeera. So I have seen how Al Jazeera has influenced public opinion globally. And Qatar has used soft power through its sports diplomacy, for example, the FIFA World Cup and the media influence of Al Jazeera. So how effective do you think these efforts have boosted Qatar's global influence?
First, if we talk about the fact that for many football fans around the world, Qatar, with all its various links, some of them very problematic, still don't aware to geopolitics. And the fact that they hear Qatar for the first time in the FIFA World Cup. And we need to remember that the FIFA World Cup is just one example. We have in 3 years the FIBA on basketball, and Qatar will host it too. And in tennis and building stadiums, the fact that sometimes you can talk to people around the world that the only connection they know about Qatar is sport, is Formula One, is about establishing stadiums, building universities, funding universities. And in the same manner, you can see it in Al Jazeera. The fact that sometimes people see this channel as, let's say, in the Gaza example. In the Gaza example, Al Jazeera established itself as the most updated and reliable. I mean, I'm putting air quotes for reason. And the fact that this was the channel to the world. For an example, I have a contact with people in Cyprus that told me that if they like to know what's happening in Gaza, Al Jazeera is the main broadcast. And they didn't know even the biased way that sometimes Al Jazeera use. Sometimes it's even very, very apparent biased news. But if you watch just one news source, if you rely on just one narrative the one that Qatar provided you. So your perspective, even if you not officially accept their point of view, is subliminally you accept the assumptions and the concept of thinking about global issues. So for this reason, and we need to remember, you talk about these two initiatives, Al Jazeera and sports. The decades of the 1990s saw another example. Just 1 year after the Al Jazeera was launched, the emir, the, the, the father emir right now, not Tamim, the emir right now, but Hamed, the father, relaunched Qatar Airways. And
Mm.
when we relaunched Qatar Airways, he proclaimed that it's going to be the best airline in the world. And when you said it in the 1990s, it sounds ridiculous to talk about this mini state, about its national airline will become, and right now, 2024, and it was the official airline that gives sponsorship to UEFA Cup. So when we talk about Qatar, we need to remember that some people hear about Qatar, but the only things they know that football, my news source, and airline tickets. And it sounds ridiculous, but this is the way that Qatar perceived in many, many words. And now we need to add to this equation the fact that Qatar at the same time was very involved in a global organization in order to promote the image it liked to promote. Again, not the image it actually had, but in fact, the image Qatar want to promote.
Yes, so you have touched on the impact of, soft power brilliantly. So now let's talk about the Qatar-Israel relations, an area that you have studied extensively. How does Qatar balance its strongest support for Palestinian causes as well as maintaining open channels of communication with Israel?
So the fact that Qatar, let's say one my first article was talk about the let's say the transform situation when until 1990 Qatari approach was to mimic its neighbors' policy toward Israel. If the UAE or mainly Saudi Arabia was against, Qatar was against also. In 1990, the entire Gulf region is changing its view toward, let's say, Israel, but the entire Middle East. Qatar decided that if its neighbors doing one thing, it's gonna be the exactly opposite.
Yes.
And the fact that the foreign minister in 1994 interviewed to the New York Times and even said it, we're sick of it that people, let's say the larger neighbors, give us orders. We have a unique foreign policy. As part of this foreign policy, we are, as a raison d'etre, contact with all sides. Again, we are not committed to any side. We are talk with Russia and with the US,
Yes.
with the Taliban and with the US. And as in the Israel example, the foreign minister gave the specific example. We are unique because we talk with Iran and Israel at the same time. And Qatar, even when Qatar was very critical, even sometimes anti-Semitic toward Israel, all the time it was very important to her how the public perception in Israel conceived it. And sometimes they launch media campaigns in order to transform public opinion in Israel. It wasn't effective, but still. Anyway, the fact that Qatar would tried to preserve its status as the one that talk with everyone. And again, for an example, as we said before, its neighbors didn't like, they perceive it as duplicity, and sometimes it was indeed duplicity. For this reason, Israel saw it as an effective member because it's a pragmatic member. But let's say, especially since October 7th, there is a reckoning in Israel for the factor that this pragmatic, and again, I give in the air quotes 2 times in a row, because it's not really pragmatic. Because as you said, at the same time, Qatari Prime Minister will talk in Israel, we can see there are events in Doha that actually support sometimes Hamas, sometimes PLO, sometimes some ambiguous terms like the Mukawama, that is basically armed resistance to Israel. So this Qatari policy that I will talk with everyone, that not just Israel, one ambassador in Qatar pointed out that it's absurd that he described to a reporter how he was in a lift in the one Doha hotels. And he said, write to me, there was a 5-star general that fight the terror organization. And in the left, there was the leader of the terror organization. And this absurd situation gave Qatar a lot of power. Sometimes as the mediation is the soft power, as you mentioned, but there is a stronger sense right now. It's not very changed the entire attitude towards Qatar, but that this policy is actually not neutrality, but hypocrisy.
So it's remarkable how Qatar manages this balancing acts. But I have looked into how the Gulf Cooperation Council has been impacted by regional dynamics. How do you see Qatar's role within the GCC growing, particularly if we talk after the diplomatic fallout from the blockade?
So first, when you talk a blockade again, we are in a problem because the UAE will not describe it as a blockade. But when this crisis, let's take a neutral term, but when this crisis resolved, we need to remember one thing. Every side presented like we are the one that was come as winners, but as a fact, Qatar won. Qatar won because there were 4 states that actually severed ties, or I don't know, and Qatar maintained some local production, but mainly extensive ties with Iran and Turkey. The same Iran that Saudi Arabia sought to, let's say, cut its relation with Doha. And the fact that Qatar won, let's say, gave a lesson to the entire region that even there is an anonymity, we no longer can to preserve it on a public level. For this reason, we can see the fact that right now, even the animosity still existed. For an example, you mentioned Gaza before. There was one royal member of Saudi royal member, Turkey Al Faisal, that officially is not on official capacity, but in Saudi Arabia is a good barometer for the royal house perception. And he, at the beginning of the war, after the October 7th, he gave an interview. And in Israel, there was very excitement because he condemned Israel, but Israel get used to it. But he also condemned Hamas. There was its fourth line in his speech was a condemnation to Qatar. And Israel didn't notice, but it's a major event because the animosity didn't disappear. It still existed, and this region is still very volatile. But right now, the GCC, Qatar, and its neighbors chose to preserve it in a low key because we saw what happened when it became public. It attracts various states to the region, and for this reason, we can see the fact that there are high levels of meetings between Qatari Emir and MBS, Qatari Emir and MBZ. And again, as official policy, there is right now flourish of ties. But let's say, the crisis didn't resolve. Under the mattress, there are still various issues that's waiting to disrupt. And for this reason, let's say like that, I think that even when the UAE or Qatar, anyone, each state to each side, doing businesses and holding conferences together, it's one eye open, one eye sleep, because this region is no longer just we have one big happy family. No, we saw what happened, and we need to remember that the controversy is still there.
So you have provided a great overview of Qatar's place within the GCC. So looking ahead, I believe that Qatar is positioning itself as a leader in addressing global challenges, from energy to conflict resolution. In your view, what are some of the critical global challenges where you believe Qatar is likely to take a more prominent leadership role? And how do you foresee its influence growing in the next decade?
So, Qatar, we mentioned at the beginning that the fact that the energy sector was a very actually profitable one. We can't deny it. But Qatar was very shrewd in this context to not rely on the energy factor. She saw, the states, it saw that the fact that other states rely on the oil, and when the oil sales start to decline, it was problematic to the economy. And what Qatar did, again, very shortly, and it's not specific to Qatar. The UAE did it also in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, but to use it for investment. For an example, just if we look the last month, the fact that the Emir was in Canada, the Emir and the Prime Minister actually was in Canada. The Emir was also in Norway and I think Finland, but the same for the memory, it's not responsible, but still, there was connection in Spain. And in every visit, you can see the word investments or economic cooperation. And Qatar was very eager to, let's say, preserve a foothold in any place that possible. Sometimes by investment, sometimes by economic, sometimes by the humanitarian. The humanitarian war of Qatar was actually a business, because when Qatar established itself in floods in Afghanistan or diseases in Yemen, the fact that you put you gain a foothold in a state. For an example, you can see what's happening in Gaza. The official stance was we come in humanitarian way. This was the reason that the Qatari Prime Minister gave for the Hamas presence on Doha. But as we saw, sometimes humanitarian facade, because Qatar used this excuse to expand its influence, its prominence, its presence, and some states even saw it as problematic. For an example, let's give an example that most viewers most likely didn't hear. Qatar established a factory to powder milk in Algeria. And the fact that 51 of the share was under Qatar dominance. And the fact that, again, it's a minor example, it's a powder milk, but Qatar, we can see in this minor example, the fact that it's in humanitarian, again, air quotes, because it's powder milk, but it's give Qatar the leverage to maintain other business in Algeria. And the same way, it will establish other schools and later investments and later on and later on. And the fact that now when you talk about Algerian economy, you have to take into account the Qatar one. And some states even saw it. Tunisia declined to receive Qatar humanitarian aid for some times, and then they accepted. Later on, when Qatar offered the Lebanon three power stations, they declined it. And the economy minister of Lebanon, who was crying, he said, "My country is on needed," but still, Lebanon understands that Qatari involvement it came with a price. And if I take this from the Middle East region, we can see the same trends happen globally. The fact this investment, the fact that humanitarian, again, sometimes, many times, facade humanitarian, and economic ties gave Qatar a foothold and a way to project itself as a member that even states, and for justified reason, said that it's Qatar is not a reliable partner. You cannot, again, it's not like a state that you can cut off because it's involved in so many businesses, initiatives, economic forums that you have to consider it, you have to accept it if you like it and if you.
So thank you so much, sir, for your expertise, Mr. Admoni. This has been a very informative and enlightening discussion, and I'm sure that our viewers must have gained valuable insights into Qatar's evolving role on the world stage. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.